Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Aaron Connor. I'm the guy in the snazzier jacket.
What's wrong with my jacket?
This is Frank Hemming, as probably all of you know at this point. So unless this is your first Medicaid Monday.
We could have a first. We could have some first timers for
Right.
sure.
Understood. So we here at Peter O'Connor and Strauss, it's not just me and Frank and Lou and Peter, right? There's a lot of other people involved. We have attorneys in all areas of our practice area, which is elder law, state and trust, guardianship litigation, state and trust litigation, Medicaid, special needs planning, business planning, etc. So we can help you with more than just a Medicaid trust.
That's true. Significantly more.
Today's agenda, Frank will recap the numbers, which I'm sure is a recap of a recap of a recap, but they are important. We're going to talk about exempt assets, or assets that don't count for your Medicaid eligibility. And then assets that do count and why we're going to put them in a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. We're going to talk about home care and some documents and deadlines. All right, Frank.
All right, so numbers, right? We do this every month. So if this is your first time seeing this, these are the eligibility numbers for home care or nursing home in a lot of respects. So for income, right, if you're one individual at home, your monthly income is now $1,752 a month. Again, not a huge number, up considerably from what it was several years ago, up $55 from last year when it was $1,697. If you're a couple at home, that number goes up to $2,371. And if you're that community spouse at home, you get to keep $38.53 and 50 cents as your income. And then the bottom number, the $50, stayed the same since 1965. That means if you were in a nursing home on Medicaid, you get to keep $50 to live on. Don't spend it all at once.
I don't understand why they just don't round up to the nearest dollar. Like we do $0.25.
Yeah,
It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
You're asking the wrong question. And then for resources or assets, right, we use those terms interchangeably. Again, if you're an individual getting on Medicaid, whether at home or in a nursing home, your asset limit is now up to $31,175. Again, up a little bit from last year when it was $30,182. Up considerably more from that when it was $16,800 prior to that. So almost doubled since that time. And again, if you're a couple where you both need services, that number goes up to $42,312. Again, up just a little bit from last year. If you're that community spouse where if your husband or wife needs Medicaid, you have an asset limit that's that $74,820 as the community spouse. And then that bottom number in the footnote, we covered we did a whole series or a whole Medicaid Monday webinar on that for spousal budgeting and things. So go back to, I think it was February for more information on what that number, because that one is confusing. But it goes up to $154,000 for the spousal share.
People always surprised to know that if they're both on Medicaid, they don't double the number.
Well, that's too easy.
They don't even get 150% of the number.
No, it's yeah. One of these days I'll have to figure out what percentage that is, but yeah,
I think it's a third.
Yeah,
right. 100.
It's got to be ballpark.
It's a very bizarre choice.
Yeah, but rather than exactly, you could just double it. That would be by far the easiest thing to do mathematically, but they did not do that.
So what's exempt, as Frank said, 31,175. Although you never want to be right up against that limit, bad things can happen. Prepaid burial for you, your spouse. If you're feeling like you want to give some money away for your kids, all right. Merry Christmas. Your burial is paid. Income producing business assets. So ideally, this isn't happening at a time when you're still working, but it does happen. Some people never retire. But lots of times this is more often a rental property. I mean, sometimes it's an active business, but most of the time I feel like it's a rental.
Yeah, generally speaking, when we're using this exception, because we don't use it very much, typically we are dealing with a situation where we're creating a trust, and then we're kind of creating an LLC or a series of LLCs as like a rental business, and then structuring that into the Medicaid plan. Whether you need a trust or not to get it Medicaid exempt, right? That's why we're saying right here you don't necessarily need the trust for protection purposes. For exemption purposes, rather, that's the better way to put that.
Right.
Because if it is an income producing asset, it doesn't count as an asset for Medicaid purposes, but there are some planning advantages and some planning reasons why you'd want to put that all within a trust, which we're going to talk about today.
Right. I certainly don't want it to go to probate.
Right.
Life insurance, that one's kind of, I don't even know how many policies we even see anymore that are less than $1,500.
I feel like we get 1 or 2 a year,
Right, maybe a Gerber policy from
yeah,
1950.
something very limited, but
Mhm.
and it's very strange because the few times we do see it, it's like that face value is going to be like $1,000 typically, but the cash value is significantly higher than that.
Right,
But because the face value is so low, that covers the exemption. So again, this is one where we don't use the exemption very much just because it's such a low number. So generally speaking, the take home point here is if you have life insurance, if it does have cash value and its face value is more than $1,500, it's that cash value that counts as an asset for Medicaid purposes. It would not be exempt like we're showing here on the slide.
here's the next one is a big advantage to living in New York State because there are only a few states that do exempt this. But your retirement account, once it's in periodic payment status, so you're receiving an RMD, it can be annual, it could be semi-annual, it could be quarterly, but it's going to be treated as monthly income, correct? But at least have to get it out annually. It's a big one. And a car.
Regardless of its value. So we've exempted expensive cars, we've exempted cars that are basically worthless. Take home point here is it is one car. So if you have multiple cars, because we do frequently see people where maybe they have a, maybe like a winter vehicle and then like their all the time vehicle. It's whatever the more valuable one is, this is the one typically we want to exempt. The second or third or whatever vehicles then count as assets and go toward that 31,175 asset number.
Right. Sometimes it's a boat, sometimes it's a camper. I mean,
We've had cases with both of those.
that's right. Your home, all right. So it can be exempt, but these are generally ones that we don't like to rely on because they are problematic in a lot of ways.
Right.
Either so transfer exemptions like caretaker child requires a pretty high level of proof. And if you want to rely on that and apply for Medicaid, you better be sure you're going to get it.
Yes. Yeah. We have used doctors, notations and documentation from the treating physician to speak to the caregiver child's like level of caregiving to help bolster this point. Typically, the other thing that weirdly gets hard to document at times is to actually document that the child's resided in the residence for 2 years.
Correct.
Because like it's not uncommon where the child will stay in the residence and essentially live there, but they don't have a paper trail that says that they live there. Like they
Correct.
still get their mail to a different address, they file their taxes under a different address, all their banking statements have a different address, their driver's license have a different address. So it's one of those things where if you can get all of the pieces of proof, it's a pretty well-known and I think pretty well received exception by the county offices. It's just a matter of can you get all your ducks in a row to prove it.
Right. And the burden is on you.
Correct.
So that's important to know. You have to prove it. So if you go to a nursing home and your spouse is living in the house is exempt. But we don't like to rely on this either because most of the time spouses are relatively close in age and health status probably has been impacted by keeping the other spouse home as long as possible.
Yes.
Too.
Yes.
So we do use it, but ultimately you need to get that house out of probate and into a trust.
Yeah, it's kind of a temporary measure to use it in this instance. So just to kind of like orient here, right? If you have a Medicaid spouse, whether that's home or in a nursing home, they can't touch the house as long as there's a well spouse in the house, right? But something could happen to the well spouse. That's normally what we're concerned about. Because even if it's exempt now, that doesn't mean it's going to be exempt later. What if something happens to the well spouse? That's what we're worried about here. We want to do planning for both spouses, not just one.
And if the well spouse should happen to pass away.
Bigger nightmare.
Right.
Yeah,
So
which we have had that unfortunately happen, where we have an institutionalized spouse. We have a spouse at home exempting the house because the well spouse is in the house, but then something unexpectedly happens to the well spouse. Now we've lost our protection for the house. Now we're in a much different scenario for both the Medicaid spouse, right? And from a planning perspective, because now we kind of have to unroll that whole scenario and then come up with the next available, like best case scenario, knowing that we lost our kind of biggest and best exemption.
right. So it is sometimes counterintuitive, but we are transferring assets for eligibility purposes many times.
Yes.
But we're doing it carefully and with knowledge of the rules, right? So we meet with a lot of people who have made these transfers without any advice. thinking that this was the right thing to do because, I don't know, their barber or their butcher, or I don't know, the candlestick maker would told them that,
Well,
this was a good idea.
so Aaron, I mean, you can certainly correct here, but I think if a transfer has been made and it has not been at the advice of an estate planning or an elder law attorney, typically it would be something called a life estate deed.
Could be,
As I said, that's, I think, if we're talking about the house,
right.
that's normally how it's done, but there's usually many reasons why we don't counsel of doing it quite that way, right? Because the thought is to get that asset out of someone's name, start that 5-year clock ticking, but there are a lot of potential dangers that come with that, with a life estate
You
deed.
can't pull it back easily. That's a big one. But a lot of times it's money though, too, because people hear that they can give $18,000 away
That's
per
true.
person per
You
year.
hear that a lot.
And yes, you can, but not for Medicaid purposes. So it's a totally different, it's a tax provision, not a Medicaid eligibility. So there's still some talk that there might be a home care look back. Keeps getting punted though, so we have no implementation date at this point.
Best we can tell you is if it's going to happen, it's going to be sometime next year, and obviously keep tuning in, because as we know more, we'll let you know more. That's what we know as of now. Could be next year. Don't know.
And when you make a transfer, not carefully, and we sometimes are accruing a penalty period on purpose, but most of the time we want to avoid the penalty period the best we can, and that's why we're doing things early, trying to get out in front of the problem. The sooner you use the trust that we're going to talk about, the better off you will be.
Yes.
So a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust. Lawyer speak, okay? It's a type of irrevocable trust, which we'll explain is not as scary as it might sound. But in there, it's a holding tank essentially for assets of yours, which you can still have some measure of control over. Certainly, if it's an investment account, you're still getting your income. If it's a house, you still have the right to live there. You have the right to modify. You have all sorts of rights. It's not as scary as it may sound. You still get your star exemption. And what we're doing here is we're setting up a plan so Medicaid can be accessed if and when you need it. Because Frank, how much does a nursing home cost roughly?
In this area, generally, I would say 16,000 is a pretty good barometer of where everything's at. I've certainly seen more than that. I've seen less than that. But if you want kind of a number that's towards the middle, think about $16,000.
Yeah, I'd be circumspect of any number less than that. This is not the kind of thing where you want to go cheap, right?
No, typically not. No.
So that's why we're doing this. Not many people can sustain that kind of monthly cost for any period of time. And even if they can, do you want to?
Right. It's
Right.
How badly would the finances be impacted by writing checks for $16,000 for an unknown period of time without it completely changing your financial outlook to the future?
Right. So this is an explanation of how a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust works. Okay. You're appointing a trustee other than you or your spouse. Could be kids, could be siblings, can be really anybody except the two of you.
Right, which for most people, it's going to be the kids, but there have also been plenty of times where people say, I love my kids. They're not good with money, or they maybe have spouses that we don't like or don't trust. So while it typically would normally be kids in most circumstances, do not feel like it has to be children, even if you have them. If you don't have them, then clearly it would be somebody else. But it could be just about anybody as long as you're comfortable with them and they would make a good choice.
And they are a fiduciary. So this is a word that we get a question about a lot. What does that mean? Well, that means that they have to act in your best interest, not their own. So again, if they're acting in their own interest, then we would remove them. Okay, that's important. You in this trust have the income for life, and this is a probate avoidance device as well. So whatever is in here passes to your heirs very easily. What can go in here? Almost anything.
Big one that you're not going to see on this list goes to that retirement account, that IRA 401 that we already talked about as being exempt for Medicaid. So for one, you don't have to put it in a trust like this because you don't have to protect it for Medicaid.
Right.
We already have that done for us because the state of New York allows it. But the other thing is, if you go to move an IRA or 401 into a trust, you would have to liquidate the account, pay income tax on the entire account, and then you would start 5 years on it, then rolling towards that exemption period, where if you just left it alone, it would have been exempt as it's at.
Well, and you lose probably 40% of the value.
in taxes, right?
Right.
Yeah, so there's many reasons why you don't put a retirement account in this trust, but just about anything else could or should go in this type of trust. So we have the list over there on the left-hand side. We frequently put homes in. For many people, it could be just the home that goes in. There might
Right.
not be other things to go in. But if there are, bank accounts can go in, your stocks and bonds can go in. If you have non-qualified annuities, they go in. Life insurance with cash value makes a lot of sense. And then if you do have that business, while it's exempt, as it's an active business, if it becomes non-active, right, or you sell it off and now you don't have a business, now you have cash, that's exactly the kind of thing also we want to put in a trust like this. And if you have different real estate holdings, right? So we have people, they have family camps, they have inherited property in other states, right? Sometimes people just have vacant land sometimes. And it doesn't happen often, but we certainly
Not it. We have a lot of vacant land.
so one of the other kind of pitfalls that people just don't really know a lot about until they talk to people like us is, so if you own real property in a second state and then you die with the property in your name, so you could have maybe your home in New York and some other property in another state, if unless you do some probate avoidance techniques, you'd have to do probate, or your family would be doing probate. Not only in New York where your primary residence is, but they'd also have to do something called an ancillary probate in the other state where that other piece of real property sits. So if going to court sounds kind of not great, don't go to court in two different places, right? If you own
Double the
different
lawyers. Nobody likes that.
No.
So as Frank said, I think we've gone over this, keep out already. And, some of this changes over time. The older you are, the more assets we're going to want in this trust. The younger you are, the more flexibility we're going to have to add things over time. Even though this trust is irrevocable, you can fire your trustee at any time if there's a problem. As I say, the bigger stick, though, really is you can change your beneficiaries. You can diminish them. You can cut them out altogether. You can be like, hey, kids, left it all to charity. Whatever.
Or grandchildren,
Right.
right? That's usually the one that people are
Right.
going to kick out their kids. It's usually because they just like the grandkids better, but
That's right.
but all is possible if it's properly drafted.
And again, if it's properly drafted, it can even be amended or revoked, even though it's called irrevocable. So lots of flexibility, no reason to really worry about it. It's a great probate avoidance device. It allows you to set up kind of cascading trusts, or as I usually say, downstream trusts, right? You can leave your money to your kids in trust to protect it for them. And again, we have all of these rights that we just talked about.
So big thing here, again, for Medicaid eligibility, depends on what type of Medicaid we're talking about in the look back period that we're referencing. So for a nursing home, the benefit of doing the trust is getting everything out of your name 5 years in advance before the bad medical event happens. And that way, if you ever do need that nursing home, anything that's been in the trust for at least 5 years is then saved from Medicaid, saved from the nursing home. Because there's no look back currently, you can freely create a trust, move everything you need into it, and then qualify for community Medicaid within essentially a month or two, just depending on where we are in the time of the month. Obviously, that second bullet is subject to change with the potential implementation of a community look back period. Again, we'll see what happens next year with that.
All right, so here's a fairly typical scenario. Generally speaking, we'd like to do a trust for a woman, man, couple earlier than 84. Right.
We're
Much
using this
earlier.
as just the example because since we are doing Medicaid Monday here, we're going to do kind of a Medicaid context of where we use the trust to create Medicaid eligibility.
Right.
But if we're taking kind of the Medicaid piece off of this, this is a planning tool that we like to use when you're right around retirement age, right? When you're single or when you're healthy, when you're just kind of living your life, you're not taking a lot of abilities away from yourselves by doing this.
Right.
It's just getting that ball rolling towards getting some protection done as you get older.
So this scenario we see weekly, if not every day, hospitalized, and then I suppose we should have had some dramatic music here, but
Next time.
future unknown. Yeah. So what kind of conditions do we have? We have mild memory loss, all right, some disorientation. Sometimes this improves. We see this a lot with infections, right? Sometimes it doesn't improve, but a lot of times if it's an infection, it does.
Or possibly it could be some of the drugs that person's receiving to care for whatever injuries they have, or other medical conditions going on. So sometimes medication is driving some of the disorientation or things like that. But again, not always, kind of fact specific.
So it's also important to note that a diagnosis of dementia by itself does not preclude somebody from doing documents, right? It
Right.
certainly raises some flags and some things that have to be kind of hammered out. But if it's early on in the process, it's not going to stop somebody from doing it.
Yeah, I mean, Aaron, I think unfortunately, like, we can use this as the example, but we unfortunately are seeing, I think, more and more people come in younger and younger because they've got a diagnosis of early onset dementia or Alzheimer's or whatever cognitive issues are going on. But just because you have the diagnosis doesn't mean that that person isn't fully aware, fully capable of doing, planning and setting their things forward to make sure that as things progress, things go as they want. So just as Aaron said, having the diagnosis doesn't preclude the plan. It just kind of steps up the urgency in which they probably should be looking into options.
That's right. So we think, based on what Rachel is going through, she's going to need about 10 hours of care.
Right, which
Could she get 24, Frank?
she could. We do have clients that have 24-hour care. I feel like every time we mention this, it's very hard to guarantee any particular number of care
Exactly.
or hours that would be awarded, because at the end of the day, it's going to be up to like multiple entities, mainly the state and typically an insurance company, that kind of pool all their resources and information together. But just because you get an initial award that you're not happy with doesn't mean that you can't then go and fight that number, that hours determination, or ask for more hours. So yes, we do have clients that have 24/7. Some just got 24/7 either right off the bat or with, I would say, minimal work after the fact. Some have had to go to as far as a fair hearing, gone before a judge, and then waited for the outcome to get decided by the judge. But yes, all of it is possible.
Waited, unfortunately. All right. So Rachel's income is 2345. All right. Both Social Security and pension are going to be treated the same. Okay. Your Social Security does not get treated differently just because of Social Security.
Right. And then again, frequently we have a lot of state employees because we're right here in the Albany area. So right. Even if it's not taxable, right, that doesn't mean anything for this calculation. If it's countable income, for Medicaid, whether it's countable, whether it's taxable or not. Let's put it that way.
Right. And so she's got a home, she's got an IRA, she's got a little bit of money in the bank, and she's got a brokerage account. So easy, house and brokerage go into her trust.
Got it.
Boom. And her IRA stays with her because it's exempt.
Yep.
And at 84, she has to be taking distributions from it.
Correct. So technically, once we set that up, if there was already getting budgeted on a monthly basis, we would budget over the IRA money. That would increase our income a little bit every month. Doesn't really change the outcome here, where everything above the 1752 goes into a pooled trust. And if you have more questions on pooled trusts, go back earlier. We had Sarah Grimes from NYSARC here to do a Medicaid Monday on pooled trust and how all that works. So once we get done orienting all of her stuff properly, now she's going to show as being asset and income eligible for Medicaid as of June 1st. Boom, because we're that good and we can do it that quickly if we have to. So timing, I think timing is always important whenever we talk about Medicaid. So we did want to add the slide here. So, right, Medicaid looks at what you have as of the first of the month. So we're kind of fortunate right now, we're right in the middle of the month. So if Rachel came to us right now, we could, as long as we moved quickly, we might have the ability to get her eligible as of June 1. It would take a lot of work and we'd have to move very quickly, but we could potentially hit June 1. If we miss June 1, then it would be July 1, just because, again, you have to be eligible on the 1st. Once it's then submitted to the Medicaid office, they have either 45 or 90 days to make that determination, just depending on the type of case. So in this instance, because Rachel needs that pooled trust, the county then is given 90 days of leeway time to process the application. If it's a non-pooled trust situation, so if she didn't have enough income above 1752 to need one, or she was just under that amount, 45 days. And then what do you need? Right, you need some identifying documents, birth certificate, ID, health insurance card, right? All the stuff that proves that you are who you say you are. You also need financial documents. So if you hit let's say if we did all of our planning, we got everything lined up as of June 1st, That's not quite the end of the road. We do then need to get statements from all the financial institutions showing the balance as of the 1st of June. We actually have to prove that come June 1, all the money was no longer hers anymore. We also want to make sure that if there's other people involved, so like if Rachel had something happen and her family was having to execute the documents on her behalf by power of attorney, you want to make sure you have all those documents in place as well. And then just kind of as a reminder, this is a home care example. So if we're talking about nursing home, then you have the 5-year look back. We're doing 5 years of records, 60 months on all the financial accounts. It's a much different type of application to do that.
So it never gets easier the longer you wait. So better off getting out in front of the problem. Again, like we said, house doesn't really affect your life at all. Certainly if you own 2 houses, doesn't affect your life at all either. And if you own property in more than one place, you need a trust no matter what, because you don't want to pay attorneys twice. So that's a big thing to get out there and get moving. If you're caring for somebody who's private paying now, maybe this is a direction you should move in. Certainly if you're private paying for any amount more than a few hours a day.
Sure.
And of course, we offer free consultation, so please contact us if you're interested in any of that. The next Medicaid Monday will be
Nursing homes. Wow. So we usually have a lot to unpack with that one. It's usually pretty numbers based too. So just to warn everybody now, going to be talking about some crisis planning and some other things, because if you don't do the Medicaid trust like we're talking about now, and then you do nursing home, then you got to do some other things.